Rome called him a hero. His name was spoken with pride in marble halls. His victories were celebrated with feasts, gold, and cheering crowds. To Rome, Julius Caesar was the man who brought order to chaos, law to barbarians, and civilization to wild lands. But far from Rome, the ground of Gaul told a very different story. The soil there was dark, not from rain, but from blood. Fields once filled with crops became silent graves. Cities that had stood for generations were emptied in a single night. Women, children, and old men vanished from history without names. Between 58 and 50 BC, while Rome celebrated, Gaul was being erased. Entire tribes did not fall in battle. They were starved until their bodies failed. They were trapped, hunted, and slaughtered without mercy. Those who survived were chained and sold like animals, scattered across the empire so they could never return home. This was not chaos. This was not anger. This was not the heat of war. It was a plan. Julius Caesar did not hide what he did. He wrote it down himself. In his own words, he described these campaigns as necessary, controlled, and justified. To him, fear was a weapon. Hunger was a tool. Death was a message meant to be understood by everyone. Resist Rome, and you will disappear. History remembers Caesar as a great leader. But if these actions were judged today, they would carry a different name. War crimes, ethnic destruction, mass murder carried out with discipline and purpose. This is not the story of how Gaul was conquered. This is the story of how it was broken. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. Julius Caesar's name echoed through Rome as a symbol of brilliance and strength. Statues were raised in his honor. Senators toasted his victories. The people cheered his triumphs. To the world, he was a hero, a man who brought civilization to wild lands, a commander whose genius shaped history. But behind the banners and the applause lay a darker truth, one Rome preferred to ignore. Between 58 and 50 BC, Caesar embarked on campaigns in Gaul that would transform him into a legendary military figure. His victories were undeniable. Tribes were defeated, lands were claimed, and Rome's power expanded. Yet, these successes came at a human cost so enormous, so calculated, that by modern standards they would be considered monstrous. Mass slaughter, starvation, enslavement, and the execution of hostages were not unfortunate consequences of war. They were the tools of a man who saw fear as a weapon and death as a message. It began with the Helvetii, a Celtic tribe seeking new lands. Over 300,000 men, women, and children attempted a peaceful migration across Roman territory. Caesar intercepted them at Bracci and struck without hesitation. Thousands fell in battle, but the true horror lay in what came after. When the survivors returned to count their dead, only a fraction remained. Over 200,000 people, civilians, warriors, elders, and children, were gone. Entire communities vanished in a single campaign, erased from their homeland not by accident, but by design. The pattern repeated across Gaul. Tribes who resisted or sought refuge were met with calculated annihilation. Negotiations were traps. Starvation was engineered. Families were torn apart, sold into slavery, or executed to make an example of resistance. Caesar's commentaries, written in his own hand, presented these massacres as necessary for military success. They were not. They were warnings carved into the bodies of the innocent, messages meant to terrify every tribe that dared defy Roman rule. Rome celebrated with feasts and games. Gaul burned. Rivers ran red. Cities once proud and bustling became graves. Survivors, if they were lucky, were scattered across the empire, their names lost, their languages silenced, their cultures erased. Every act of violence was recorded, every atrocity justified, every death transformed into a tool for Caesar's ambition. And yet, in the marble halls of Rome, none spoke the truth aloud. The world remembered the hero. The people of Gaul remembered the horror. By the time his campaigns ended, Caesar had not just conquered land. He had conquered life itself, leaving behind a landscape scarred, empty, and trembling under the shadow of his ambition. The story of conquest was told in triumph, but the real story, the story of systematic terror, was left unspoken, hidden in the soil and bones of a broken land. The land of Gaul, with its rolling hills and dense forests, had never known terror like this. Villages and towns that had thrived for generations were now trembling under the shadow of a single man. Julius Caesar's campaigns were not the chaos of battle. They were a machine of destruction, planned and executed with precision. Each attack, each siege, each slaughter was designed to instill a single idea: resist Rome, and you will be erased. The Germanic tribes crossing into Gaul quickly discovered that Caesar's fury knew no limits. When the Ucusipates and Tancari fled from their homelands, seeking safety among the Gallic tribes, Caesar met them not with negotiation, but with calculated annihilation. Tribal envoys arrived at his camp, seeking terms, hoping for mercy. Instead, Caesar struck while the tribe's leaders were still discussing surrender. Roman cavalry swept into the camps at dawn, leaving no one alive. Warriors, elders, women, and children alike were cut down. Ancient accounts suggest over 400,000 people were killed in a single day. The Rhine itself seemed to overflow with the dead. And yet, Caesar recorded these massacres as if they were routine military successes. He described them as necessary to prevent rebellion, as if murdering entire populations was a strategy rather than a crime. But the truth was chilling. The scale of violence far exceeded any military necessity. Tribes that posed no threat were exterminated purely to spread fear. Caesar's message to Gaul was unmistakable: resist, and your world will end. There was no negotiation, no mercy, no room for humanity. Only survival for those who submitted. The terror was not limited to killing. Caesar understood that hunger could be as powerful as the sword. During the rebellion of 52 BC, the Gallic leader, Vercingetorix, employed scorched earth tactics, burning towns and crops to deny Roman supplies. Caesar's response was cold and deliberate. He targeted cities like Avaricum, where tens of thousands had sought refuge. He trapped them, cutting off their food, waiting patiently as starvation gnawed at the population. Days turned into weeks. Children grew weak in their mother's arms. The elderly could barely stand. And all the while, Caesar's legions remained disciplined, fed on their rare meat, watching their enemy waste away under the weight of hunger. When the siege finally ended, the city fell. Caesar's soldiers, starved and frustrated by weeks of conflict, showed no mercy. Every man, woman, and child was killed, save for a handful who escaped. A city that had been a jewel of the Bituriges tribe became a graveyard, a warning to every other settlement in Gaul. Hunger had become a weapon, death a lesson, and Caesar wrote it down as if it were nothing more than a routine victory. The rivers, the forests, the villages, they were witnesses to systematic terror. Each act, each death, each broken family reinforced one truth. Under Caesar, defiance had a price that no tribe could pay. Gaul was no longer a land of villages and traditions. It was a land of fear, a place where survival depended not on courage or skill, but on submission to a man who saw humanity only as a tool, a number, a target. Caesar's cruelty did not end with the dead. For those who survived his massacres, the nightmare only deepened. Entire populations were captured, sold into slavery, and scattered across the Roman Empire. Families were torn apart, villages emptied, and communities erased from existence. The goal was not only control, it was total domination, a methodical erasure of culture, language, and identity. After defeating the Veneti, a powerful maritime tribe, Caesar ordered the execution of their council of elders. The rest of the population, tens of thousands of people, were sold into slavery. Their homes, their lands, their very names vanished as they were forced onto ships bound for distant cities. Soldiers and traders collected their spoils with clinical efficiency. Slavery, in Caesar's hands, was not punishment alone. It was currency, a tool for funding wars, rewarding loyalty, and cementing power. The Aedui, another tribe, surrendered after a siege, hoping for mercy. Instead, Caesar treated them the same way he had the Veneti. 53,000 men, women, and children were captured and sold in a single lot. Imagine the chaos and despair as entire families were separated, some never to see each other again. Fathers sold to mines, mothers to households, children to strangers in lands they would never know. Civilization for them had ended, replaced by the cold reality of chains and forced labor. Caesar's records conveniently omitted these details. In his commentaries, he described prisoners as casualties of war, killed in battle, or defeated in strategic campaigns. The truth, enslavement on an industrial scale, was hidden behind words crafted to glorify his military genius. Meanwhile, the conquered peoples of Gaul were scattered, ensuring that no tribe could reunite to resist Rome again. This was not just conquest. It was calculated destruction of society itself. The psychological impact was profound. Survivors carried trauma in their bodies and minds. Communities lost their elders, leaders, and culture bearers. Languages faded. Traditions were forgotten. Children grew up in foreign lands, unable to speak their native tongue. The very soul of Gaul was under siege, long after the swords had gone silent. Slavery became a permanent reminder. Resistance was futile, rebellion meant obliteration. Even among the Roman soldiers, the horrors became normalized. They were rewarded for their complicity, given spoils, land, or slaves to secure their loyalty. Caesar understood that power required not just fear of death, but fear of life under his control. Every village burned, every tribe enslaved, reinforced his reputation as the unstoppable commander, but also as a man whose ambition had no limit, no conscience, and no mercy. By the time his campaigns in Gaul ended, millions had died, and millions more had been enslaved. The land's beauty, its forests, rivers, and villages, could not mask the scars left behind. Entire civilizations had been shattered, leaving only silence, fear, and chains in the wake of Caesar's unstoppable ambition. Caesar's brutality was not limited to the battlefield or the enslavement of survivors. He understood the power of human life as a tool of control. Children, elders, and families were seized as hostages, held not for safety, but as weapons. Each hostage was a warning, a threat, a means to bend entire communities to his will. Negotiation with Caesar was never honest. It was extortion under the guise of diplomacy. Resistance meant death. Submission meant slavery or permanent loss of freedom. When tribal leaders arrived to discuss alliances or surrender, they risked everything. Their children were taken, held captive to guarantee obedience. Any hint of rebellion brought swift consequences. Caesar's use of hostages was methodical, systematic, and terrifying. Entire communities could be controlled by the threat of harm to the youngest, weakest, or most beloved members. Fear became more powerful than swords or siege engines. It controlled the mind as effectively as Rome controlled the land. One of the most chilling examples was Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who had united tribes in defiance of Rome. After the fall of Alesia in 52 BC, he surrendered to save his remaining people. He did not beg for freedom or mercy. Instead, he was chained, transported to Rome, and imprisoned in the Tullianum, a dark and infamous cell for Rome's most dangerous enemies. For 6 long years, he lived in darkness, stripped of everything, while Rome paraded him as proof of Caesar's triumph. When his life finally ended, it was in secrecy, after the grand spectacle of his public humiliation. His body was denied burial, leaving his name and memory as a cautionary tale for anyone daring to oppose Rome. Hostages from smaller tribes suffered equally grim fates. At Uxellodunum, the last stronghold of Gallic resistance, Caesar captured the defenders after their city surrendered. He chose terror over immediate slaughter. The soldiers mutilated the men as punishment, leaving them to wander their lands crippled and broken. Families were left without protectors, fields abandoned, and communities shattered. The survivors carried scars that would outlive the war, living monuments of Caesar's cruelty and a warning to anyone who dared resist. Through these acts, Caesar created more than fear. He engineered despair. He turned loyalty into submission, negotiation into a gamble with lives, and cities into lessons. Every hostage, every mutilated survivor, every chained child carried a single, clear message: challenge Rome, and your life, your family, and your people would be forfeit. The echo of these actions traveled far beyond the battlefield. Tribes who had not yet faced him trembled at the thought of capture, the thought of children taken, the thought of families destroyed for defiance. Caesar's power was not just military, it was psychological. The mind of Gaul itself became a battlefield, and fear was the weapon of choice. When the swords were sheathed and the Roman banners lowered, Gaul was not at peace. It was silent, not the quiet of a calm land, but the oppressive silence of fear, grief, and loss. Cities that had thrived for generations lay in ruins. Villages had been emptied. Rivers ran with blood, but more haunting than that was the absence of life, the laughter of children, the voices of elders, the songs of communities wiped from memory. Caesar's conquest had not just claimed land, it had claimed humanity itself. Survivors wandered a broken landscape, carrying memories of horror they could never erase. Families had been torn apart, their members sold into slavery or executed. Tribes that once roamed forests freely were scattered, forced to rebuild from nothing. Even those who survived intact could never return to their ancestral homes. Fields lay abandoned, temples and homes destroyed, forests charred. The land, which had once sustained generations, was now a graveyard, echoing with loss. But the damage went deeper than physical destruction. Culture, traditions, and identity were under siege. Language faded as entire communities were enslaved and dispersed across the Roman Empire. Rituals, festivals, and knowledge that had been passed down for centuries disappeared with the people who once held them. Caesar had not only broken the bodies of the Gallic people, he had broken their spirit. What remained was submission, fear, and memory of what had been lost. Economically, Gaul was crippled. The enslaved workforce enriched Rome and Caesar personally, while the land was left empty of those who could farm, build, or defend it. The rivers, forests, and cities carried scars of devastation for years. Survivors faced hunger, homelessness, and despair. Children who had witnessed the deaths of their parents or the enslavement of their families grew up with trauma that would shape the next generation. Entire societies had been erased in the span of a decade, leaving nothing but silence and grief in their place. Even Caesar's political enemies in Rome noticed the horror. Some senators questioned his actions, uneasy at the scale of the destruction. But Caesar's ambition outweighed justice, and his victories were celebrated, masking the darkness that had been unleashed. The triumphs in marble halls could never capture the screams of the living or the silence of the dead. History remembers Caesar as a brilliant general, a master of strategy, a hero of Rome. But the true cost of his campaigns lay hidden in the ruins of Gaul. Millions killed, countless others enslaved, and a culture nearly erased. For the people who survived, victory had a bitter taste. They were alive, but their world had ended. Caesar had not merely conquered Gaul, he had broken it, reshaped it, and left behind a warning. Defiance was impossible, and resistance meant annihilation. The land would remember, even if the world celebrated. Julius Caesar returned to Rome triumphant. Crowds cheered his victories, statues were erected, and songs praised his brilliance. To the citizens, he was a hero, the man who expanded Rome's power and brought civilization to distant lands. Yet, behind the splendor of the triumph lay a darker reality, one that few could see, and fewer dared to speak aloud. The lands of Gaul had been broken, its people destroyed, its spirit crushed. The applause of Rome could not drown out the cries of the countless innocent lives lost. The scope of Caesar's ambition was staggering. He had not fought merely for glory. He had fought to impose his will over life itself. Entire tribes were exterminated, populations starved into submission, survivors enslaved and scattered, hostages executed as tools of terror. Every act was deliberate, every atrocity a strategy. The conquest of Gaul was not a story of military genius alone. It was a story of systematic cruelty, calculated to inspire fear as much as respect. Yet, history remembers the hero, not the horror. The textbooks, the statues, and the stories told of triumph and glory. Few recorded the suffering that lay behind each victory. Fields that once grew crops were graves. Cities that once thrived were empty. Cultures, languages, and communities had been erased, leaving survivors with nothing but memory and trauma. Caesar's ambition had achieved more than conquest. It had rewritten the landscape of life, turning thriving lands into monuments of fear. Even centuries later, the moral questions linger. Could greatness ever justify the annihilation of millions? Could ambition excuse the suffering of entire populations? Modern eyes see what ancient Rome ignored. The actions of Caesar in Gaul, measured by today's standards, would be considered war crimes. The same man celebrated as a hero committed acts so extreme that they still shock the conscience. But perhaps that is the lesson. History does not always reward virtue, and greatness does not always reflect goodness. Caesar's campaigns remind us that power, unchecked and ruthless, can transform achievement into horror. Triumph, when pursued without morality, becomes destruction. Leadership, when wielded without conscience, becomes tyranny. And so, the shadow of Caesar's ambition stretches far beyond Rome. It lingers in the silent fields of Gaul, in the rivers that once carried blood, in the ruins of cities and memories of enslaved generations. It is a reminder that behind every celebrated hero, there may lie a darker truth, one that history chooses to forget, but the land itself will never forgive. Gaul endured, but it was forever marked. And those who hear the story today can only wonder, at what cost does greatness come?